There's a problem that we all face, and that is that certain things repeat over and over again. We become very familiar with them, and then we take them for granted, and we stop thinking about them. And then all of a sudden we discover that things aren't the way we thought. They don't mean what we thought, and it's a bit of a jolt. To me, it's always a jolt because I think of myself as an intelligent, thinking person, and then I discover that I was asleep when I was dealing with these things. This happens with the texts of prayer very regularly. I want to share one with you right now. At the bottom of the page in the gray is the addition that we insert in the prayers for the two holidays, Chanukah and Purim. I want to go through the one that describes Chanukah. And I'm going to read through it. And as I read through it, think about Chanukah, think about what you know about Chanukah, what we're doing, and see how the text relates to what's going on. For the miracles, the salvation, the mighty deeds, victories, battles you perform for our forefathers these days at this time. The days of Matisyahu, son of Yochanan, high priest, the Chazmonayim, and his sons, when the wicked Greek kingdom rose up against your people in Israel to make them forget your Torah and compel them to stray from the statutes of your will, you, in your great mercy, stood up for them in the time of their distress. You took up their grievance, judged their claim, avenged their wrong. You delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton into the hands of the diligent students of your Torah. For yourself you made a great and holy name in your world. And for your people, Israel, you worked a great victory and salvation as this very day. Therefore your children came to the Holy of Holies of your house, cleansed your temple, purified the site of your holiness, and kindled lights in the courtyards of your sanctuary. And they established these 8 days of Hanukkah to express thanks and praise to your great name. Something strike you as odd here? No. How about something odd by omission? If all you had was this text, that was the only source you had about Hanukkah, what would you be missing? The oil. You'd be missing the miracle of the oil. There isn't a clue here that there's a miracle of the oil. It's all about battles, armies, victories. The many into the hands of the few, the strong at the hands of the weak. It does say at the end they cleaned out the temple and dedicated it, and lit the lights, but no hint that's a miracle there involved. I think that's passing strange. So maybe you'll opine that, okay, when we're davening and in the Birchas Hamazon that we say after eating bread, it's the same paragraph. For some reason or other, it should be omitted, overlooked. How about when we're actually lighting the menorah? We're actually lighting the menorah. Aren't we lighting the menorah in order to commemorate the miracle of the oil? Isn't that why we're doing it? Right in the middle of the page, this is the paragraph that we say while we're lighting the candles. These lights we kindle upon the miracles, the wonders, the salvations and the battles which you performed for our forefathers in those days at this season through your holy priests. During all 8 days of Hanukkah, these lights are sacred. We're not permitted to make ordinary use of them, only to look at them in order to express thanks and praise to your great name for your miracles, your wonders, and your salvations. Any clue here there was a miracle of the oil? And the only thing that's mentioned in any detail is salvations and battles. That's clearly the war. Isn't that strange? When you're lighting the menorah, shouldn't you say, and you made a miracle of the oil that lasted 8 days instead of 1 day? But not a word. That's very strange. That needs to be explained. Number one. Number two, the Maharal wrote a whole essay on Chanukah called Ner Mitzvah. He says something which isn't obvious to many, but he says it, and he himself is a major authority. He says that if you had been observing the battles of the Maccabees against the Greek army, you would not have seen any open miracles. You would not have seen any open miracles. We just said, the many into the hands of the few and the strong into the hands of the weak. Is that really unheard of in history? Don't remind Americans about the Vietnam era when a primitive, backward nation somehow stymied the Americans to the point where they ended up with the whole country making it communist. And I'm confident there are no people here from Britain who will be embarrassed by the independence war of the Americans against the British, where the British had one of the finest armies in the world, and that was a time when they said the sun never sets on the British Empire because they had provinces all over the world. They sent their fine army to America, and they were defeated by a bunch of ragtag amateurs. Doesn't it happen that smaller, weaker, less well-equipped armies defeat greater armies, especially when the smaller is fighting on his home turf for independence? And when the attacker, he can represent an empire, but they're mercenaries. They're people who are paid to fight and have no personal stake in winning or losing other than getting paid. Doesn't it happen in natural history, what we think of as natural history, where the smaller, less well-equipped army defeats the greater army? Says the Maharal, if you had been attached to the Maccabean forces, you would not have seen the earth open up under the Greek forces and swallow them up, nor boulders fall down from heavens on them. There was no open miracles. Maharal says the emphasis in the prayers is to teach us something crucial about the message of Hanukkah. And this is an application of the theme we've been talking about for 4 days, the theme of nature. And that is that we should not divide the world into miracles, which happen once in 1,000 years, and that's where God acts in the world, and the rest of the time God is on vacation, and nature carries the world, and God intervenes when he deems it necessary to intervene, and the rest of the time it carries on its own. That's a mistake. The point of Hanukkah is to teach you how to look at the seemingly natural. That's the point of it. Yes, the open miracle was the miracle of the oil. But the point of that miracle is to teach you how to look at the war. That's the real message. The real message is to look at the war in a different fashion. How do the two interact? How do they relate? Well, after all, who started the war? You read now everywhere, certainly in the sanctified New York Times, that's irony, in case you missed it, and other places as well, the first war of national liberation, the first war that's in support of universal human rights and conscience and freedom and so on and so on. Well, don't tell this to people who might be too offended, upset by it, but that's just baloney. The Maccabees were not in favor of freedom of religion. They would not have been happy. They would not have tolerated someone who wanted to practice polytheism and idol worship in the land of Israel on the grounds that we just fought a battle for freedom and self-determination. No, the Maccabees represented the truth of the Torah, and the Torah is God's way that the world has to run, in particular how the Jewish people has to run, and it was to remove oppression that stopped them from fulfilling what the Torah wants from us. It was not the beginning of a national liberation war, as certain political parties want to use it to reinforce their own ideologies. Not at all. Now, it was started by the Maccabees, who were priests. It started when a certain abomination took place in the temple, that the Greeks offered a pig. Not as if pigs were specifically not only designed to spite us, the use of pigs in sacrifices was very widespread. In the non-Jewish world, it was very widespread. But to offer a pig in the Jewish temple is not just a Greek saying, let's do here what we usually do. They knew very well what they were doing. They knew what we stood for. They knew what role the pig has in our thought system. And they did it to say, we're Greekifying it in such a way that we're de-Judaizing it. We're going to do something which is an abomination to you in your own holiest place. And it was the Maccabees as priests who led the revolt. The revolt was specifically theological. It wasn't liberal politics, it was theological. An outrage has taken place in the location that God makes his presence felt, and we can't live with that. And we're prepared to put our lives down for that. So, how does the war proceed? The war proceeds from south to north. They're driving the Greeks, the Syrian Greeks, back to the north. They reach Jerusalem, which is only halfway through. The war did not end when they conquered Jerusalem and cleaned out the temple and set up the menorah and lit the lights. It didn't end then. It went on for months afterwards. They come into the temple, they clean it out, and they light the menorah. Immediately, there's a miracle. Immediately, there's a miracle. If you're fighting this battle, what do you feel when that miracle takes place? What you feel is, God is with us. We made the right decision, and he's behind us, and he's showing us that he's with us. It isn't as if, maybe we should call off the war. Oil's the whole thing. Let's double oil production and let's export it to the rest of the world and convert them. No. They continue the battle. But since the battle was for the sake of rededicating the temple, they get confirmation that the war is something that God wants and that he's with them in the war. This is the crucial message. When you are living your life and things happen the way you expect them to happen, or within the range of normal variations, normal fluctuations, and you think to yourself, okay, that's the world doing what it usually does, that's a trap. That's a trap. Because then you lose sight of the fact that it's all divine providence. And as a matter of fact, the purpose of this miracle and the miracle of Purim, both of them, are to teach in a open, observational way that you shouldn't look at the normal progress of life as if it were absent of divine providence. It's all an expression of divine providence. Indeed, there's a progression going from Egypt, the miracles in Egypt, the plagues, through Purim to Chanukah, expressing this idea in ever greater measure, where Chanukah is the last of them. I want to trace that development for you. And that's the bottom line of what we have to experience when we light the menorah, to think, I'm saying Haneres Halolo. And Haneres Halolo says there were battles. And that's what the lighting of the lights is supposed to push me to understand. Not as if the miracle of the oil is irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. But the big message, says the Maharal, is how do you look at what seems to be natural. Well, let's go back to do deep background. Let's talk about the plagues in Egypt. The plagues in Egypt divide into two categories. The Rambam says this. He uses it for a different purpose, but he talks about the same division. Some of the plagues are anti-natural. The river turns to blood. Rivers don't turn to blood. There is a period of darkness where, for at least 72 hours, there's total darkness, and it becomes substantive so that you can't move. Nothing like that happens. The death of the firstborn, there are no medical conditions that attack firstborn children. That's just not a medical category. Those miracles break nature. Now, imagine a polytheist looking at those events. How does he see them? What do they mean to him? How does he interpret them? He's not two-faced. Remember that in the polytheistic ancient world, there was no religious competition. There was no religious competition. Every group that had its religion agreed that the other group's religion is valid. It's true. The Babylonians agreed that the Egyptian gods are real gods. The Egyptians agreed that the Babylonian gods are real gods. Indeed, a war between two nations is a war between the two sets of gods. No one has a complaint about somebody else's religion. Maybe some misguided, modern, I won't say the political term, would envy that. The ancient world was all Los Angeles. You do what's good for you, I'll do what's good for me, and we appreciate each other. So there were no religious wars. There was nothing to fight about. So an Egyptian witnessing these events will say, okay, we understood the Jews have a God. Every nation has a God. Up until now, we thought the Jewish God was impotent. The Egyptians have been enslaving the Jews for 90 years. He didn't do anything. Okay, so it's a weak God, secondary God. Now we see that he can do things that we didn't appreciate. He has certain powers. That doesn't mean they recognize the one creator of the universe and give up their own religion. All it means is, when I take account of how to navigate the world, one thing I have to keep in mind is that the Jews also have a God, and, one has to try to stay on the right side of all the powers that are applying. It doesn't challenge his point of view. But the other plagues have a different character. Let's take frogs. Egypt is inundated with frogs. Where do the frogs come from? River. They come from the river. It says so in the text explicitly. But that's where frogs always breed. That's where they always come from. They always come from the river. Only this time they come in spectacularly greater numbers. And they come exactly when Moses says they'll come. And they leave exactly when Moses says they'll leave. So here you have what I would call a hybrid. It's a miraculous event built on a natural source. It's clearly miraculous because a human being can't normally predict when there'll be a gigantic infestation of frogs. And quantity of the infestation was unprecedented, but the frogs didn't fall from the sky or grow out of the flower pots, which would have been much more unnatural, much more striking. No, they came from the river where they always came from. That's true for all the intermediary plagues. Lice. People have lice, and until let's say last 20 or 25 years in this country, it was very common. You had lice checks in the schools, and there's always some proportion of the people who have lice. You don't have everybody infested with lice at the same time. It doesn't happen. Cattle sickness. Cattle get sick. Cows get sick. Sheep and goats get sick, and they die. But not all of them at once. An infestation of wild animals. There were wild animals in the hills, but they were typically afraid of human habitation. They lost their fear. They came and swamped. Locusts. Locusts exist in this part of the world. Locusts travel from place to place. You know how they travel? They travel on the wind. They do have wings, but they can't fly hundreds of miles. They travel on the wind. The Torah says explicitly they were blown in on the wind. That means it's a natural process, but again, Moses said exactly when it would start. The infestation was quantitatively greater than it had ever been before. They ended exactly when Moses said it would end. This is a hybrid. It's a natural process expressing itself in a supernatural way. Now let's think of the message of that. Imagine a polytheist, an ancient polytheist, who's looking at these events. How does he take them? Well, how does he structure his world? There's a god of the sun, and a god of the wind, and a god of the sea, and a god of death, and a god of fertility, and a god of victory in war. Why? Because these are natural forces, forces he doesn't understand, forces he can't predict, and he pictures them in a way that's familiar to him. There are intelligent agents behind each one. But there's only one. There's only one God of the sun, not two. No competition for the sun. Only one God of the moon, one God of the sea, one God of death. No competitions for these agencies. Now, what about frog production? Of course there's a God in charge of frog production. The gods are in charge of everything. Who's doing it? Well, up until now, it was either the Nile, which was a god, or an ally of the Nile. Somewhat of the gods was in charge. But for 1 week, it's quite clear that it's the Jewish God who's doing it. It's the Jewish God who's producing the frogs. So who produces the frogs the rest of the time? Well, if you have a consistent picture and use the same methodology, that leads you in the direction of thinking, maybe the rest of the time, the Jewish God was doing it also. Only the rest of the time, he was doing it small scale. And now, when it suited his purposes, he did it large scale. And that will be true for cattle sickness. And it'll be true for lice. And it'll be true for the animals invading. And it'll be true for the wind, blowing the wind. Same thing is true, by the way, the splitting of the sea. The splitting of the sea was was done by a strong wind that blew all night. Why? Who needs the wind? God doesn't need a wind to blow it. He's making a point that what you think of as the forces of nature are really expressions of the Jewish God's activity also. This spreads the effect of the Jewish God into what formerly would have been thought of as the realm of nature or the realm of other gods. Jewish God is taking over multiple functions. That's a process that started in Egypt. Purim, you have a continuation of the process. Let's just recall the events with which the book of Esther starts, and as I recite them, imagine yourself living through them. Achashverosh, the king, has a party, 6 months. He knew how to party. Even Los Angeles could learn something from him. And at the end of the party, when he's a bit high, he makes a appeal that the queen should make a showing. There's a whole political intrigue behind this. I'm not going to go into that for now. And she says no. She spites him. And he's now realized that he's got a rebellion on his hands, and he calls on his advisors and asks them how to handle it. And the advisors say, if you read the text carefully, make it into a feminist issue and do something to make sure that women will respect men and women will be subjugated to men. It's a real feminist issue in the first chapter there. And he does so, and she's removed. Now, imagine you lived through that. What do you say? These Oriental potentates and this guy who can party for 6 months, and drink for 6 months, who knows what he can do? Would you say that this is a miracle? Why? These are just politics and Oriental intrigue. Then they have to get a new queen. And there's a beauty search. And Esther is taken into the group along with thousands of other women. And she's chosen. What's the probability of that? Well, obviously, whoever is chosen, it's a very low probability. Lotteries are engines that produce events of low probability. Not always when an event of low probability is it a puzzle or a miracle. A lottery is something that's designed to produce an event with low probability, that George won rather than somebody else. So she won. Must I call that a miracle? I don't think so. There's nothing in it. Whoever won with very low probability. Now there's a plot on the king's life, and Mordecai discovers it and tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, and the plot is foiled. The king is saved. There are plots on kings' lives. Very often. Almost always they're foiled, otherwise it would hardly pay to be a king because you wouldn't last long. Almost all of them get foiled. So the fact that there's a plot, Mordecai happened to overhear it, must I regard that as a miracle? Now, the king doesn't reward Mordecai. That's pretty puzzling. You would think that if somebody saves your life, you'd reward him to encourage other people to save your life. It's the sort of thing you'd like people to do. But the Jews were a downtrodden nation, even though Ahasuerus was the emperor of the whole area, but we were in a worse position because we had no homeland. We were in exile. So maybe he felt that honoring a Jew was unnecessary or politically inappropriate, and he didn't do it. Still, although it's odd, to say that it's a miracle is not demanded of the facts, not demanded by the facts. Now, Haman arises, and he decides that he hates Mordecai. Because he hates Mordecai, he's going to attack the whole Jewish people. And he decides that he can't stand Mordecai's existence. He's going into the king to ask him for permission to kill Mordecai. He's already erected a gallows to kill him. Before he gets there, it's nighttime, and the king can't sleep. So the king says, bring the history books, because everybody knows history puts you to sleep, right? No historians here. Huh? And it just so happens the history book is open to the incident that took place 4 years before, when Mordecai saved the king's life. And now when he hears this, he thinks, gee, did we do anything to reward Mordecai? Suddenly, his conscience disturbs him. We didn't do anything to reward Mordecai. No, we didn't. Let's see. We've got to do something for Mordecai. Who's in the courtyard? Haman's walking in to tell the king to kill Mordecai. And the king says, oh, come in, Haman. Have I got a project for you? Go and honor Mordecai in public. At that point, I think the reader says, that's going too far. That's going too far. Normally, In normal life, that doesn't happen. It's too much of a coincidence. It's too engineered to be accepted as just a coincidence. That's right. That's the point of the book. The point of the book is to tell you here, you have to admit that it's a miracle. This is not something that would happen just by chance. Okay, and then Esther is queen, and she's right in a position where she can intercede on the behalf of the Jewish people and save the Jewish people. At the end of the book, you see clearly that miracles are taking place. That's fine. That's obvious. That's open to everyone. I want to take one baby step beyond that. Now go back and re-examine the events at the beginning of the book. So let's see, Ahasuerus had this party, and he called for the queen to come, and the queen didn't come, and then his advisors advised him to have her removed. Was that just happenstance? After all, that's how Esther got in. That's how she was there and able to save the Jewish people years later. Doesn't it now look as if it was contrived? Mordecai overheard the plot, and he told Esther, and the plot was foiled. Was that just happenstance? He just happened to be there. He happened to know the foreign language they were speaking, so he picked it up. And the king decided not to honor him, to reward him. Was that just happenstance? But look, that's what set up the ability to withstand Haman when he's coming to have him killed. That moment that was called in and used to defeat Haman. So now you go back years before and say, well, maybe the fact that Mordecai was there and overheard the plot was solved and he wasn't rewarded, that also was planned in order to set up the final salvation. The intellectual path here is to live through events which strike you as natural, and then later to have to go back and reinterpret them and unsee them as an expression of divine providence. That's a very valuable lesson. Here, God taught the lesson in a way that a whole generation saw it in front of them. But, you know, one of the chief differences between human beings and squirrels is that every squirrel repeats the life of every other squirrel since the beginning of time. There's no progress. Human beings have cumulative culture. We don't have to invent the wheel in every generation. It's invented once and be carried forth. The next generation can invent something else. Once you have that experience and you have it on record, later generations can say, okay, they learned a lesson and I can learn it also without going through the same process again. What looks as if it is just natural events is just a way of God hiding his agency, but his agency is there. Now, that's what happened in Purim. It was very important that the Purim event took place in exile. This took place in Persia. For many people, once the temple is destroyed, the false prophet said to Jeremiah, God will not abandon his temple. God will not abandon his city. The Babylonians can't possibly conquer us. And Jeremiah said to them, you're making a mistake. God has told me Babylonians are going to succeed. For many people, when they went to Babylon, it was over. It was over. Jeremiah predicted it, and he told them that this is God's way of repairing the failures and trying to bring them to a higher state of being. For many people, it was over, so much so that when 70 years later, the second temple was inaugurated, only a minority of people came back. The rest of the people didn't come back. So that's why this miracle in Persia was very important. Don't think that because you're in exile and you're powerless, that I've abandoned you. No, I'm here with you also. And I'm showing you that what looks as if it's natural is really divine providence. Now, in this certain sense, Chanukah was worse. Chanukah was worse for two reasons. First of all, because in Purim, they only. The attack was on the physical. The attack was physical annihilation. In Chanukah, the attack was spiritual annihilation. The fact that your body keeps on living, but your mind and heart are filled with false ideas, false goals, disconnected from the reality, is, in our terms, worse than physical death. And the attack took place in the land of Israel in a way that's worse. If you're in exile, it's natural to expect, it's wrong, but it's natural to expect, you're outside the land of Israel, things aren't running the same way, the same elevation, the same spirituality, the same divine attention. But that the attack could actually overpower us in the land of Israel, not destroy the temple, but to use the temple for idol worship, abominable idol worship. That was a greater challenge to the idea that God is running the world. And that's why another miracle had to take place. And the second miracle was one which had the same message. The open, visible part of the miracle was the oil. But the message was that the war that you fought, are fighting, and will win, is something where God's providence is what is running the war. That's precisely why there were no, according to Maharal, there were no open miracles in the battles. Because what you have to learn to do is see that in the natural, that's an expression of divine providence as well. Now, these two, there's a blessing that we make when we light the candles. The miracles that you did for our forefathers, by Yamim Haim, in those days, Bazman Hazeh, in this time. So the simple explanation of those words is, this happened thousands of years ago, but it happened in these dates of the year. And we're now recording, we're celebrating what happened at these days of the year. But actually, those words, Bazman Hazeh, have another two very important implications. One is, for us, we who lived and to a certain extent still live in exile, because until the majority of Jews live in the land of Israel, legally, the exile is still in force. There are certain mitzvos that will only come back into force when the majority of Jews live in the land of Israel, and that has not yet happened. So we're talking about 2,000 years of exile. And in those 2,000 years, a great deal of the history looks natural. There has to be an antidote to that. And the antidote is that you look back and say, there was another time in Jewish history when they were living under what looked like natural conditions. And they were shown forcefully that what looked like natural conditions are divine providence, and that we have to learn applies in our day as well. The second implication of those words, I just saw an essay from the Siva Shalom. Siva Shalom, that's the name of the Sefer, was the Slonim Rebbe up until about, 10 years ago when he was Nifter. He was a great scholar, a great leader. He was the one who refounded the Hasidus after the Holocaust. And he asks the following question. There were other events in Jewish history, open miracles, for which we have no holidays. Sancherib besieged the city of Jerusalem. He surrounded it with a gigantic army. In one night, the entire army died. We have no holiday to celebrate that. I, frankly, don't remember what date that happened on. I don't think I'm alone. You ask many, many religious Jews, what date was it that Sancherib's army was destroyed? Don't know. What's the difference between those miracles that become celebrated annually, forever, and those that don't? And the Slonim Rebbe cites a few words about the miracle of Hanukkah. It describes, the Gemara describes the miracle that happened, and then it said, and the following year, they established the performance, the mitzvos that we do on Hanukkah. Following year? Let's say it was the following year. Who cares? Why does the Gemara bother to mention that it was the following year? The Slonim Rebbe said this. Our holidays are not historical. Our holidays are not historical. They don't celebrate things that happened in the past. Some things that happened in the past plant in the world a living potential. And every time the date comes back, that potential is available and can be realized if you interact with it in the appropriate way. And usually the appropriate way is to mirror what happened on the original event. That's why we have a Seder every beginning of Pesach every year, because they had a Seder in Egypt. That's what they did. And we do the same thing. We dwell in Sukkos because that's what they did in the wilderness. Of course, it was the clouds of glory. It's a long story, but that's what they lit a menorah in the temple. We light a menorah. The holiday of Purim was celebrated at that time with feasting. We've been feasting for 2,500 years since then. That's because the same spiritual potential repeats itself every year. Not every miracle in history does that. The destruction of the army of Sancherib does not create, on that date, further every year that same potential, and therefore there's no holiday celebrating it, because the holidays are not historical. They're not to remember what happened once upon a time. That to realize that recurring potential, and not every holiday has that recurring potential. And that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says they waited a year to see, will that same potential recur? Will it reassert itself? If so, then we should do something to recognize it and to exploit it. If not, we'll ignore it, just like Sancher's event was ignored. When they saw that it did, so that's Bazman Hazeh. Bazman Hazeh means we're doing it now because this date, these dates are the dates in which that potential is available. That potential is the potential of seeing the world in appropriate fashion. To see that what looks like something that's purely natural, purely accidental, is something which is really divine providence. That's why in the prayers you have the heavy emphasis on the war, because that's the challenge. The challenge is to see that what looked like the war is in fact divine providence, and that being the case, to accept it as such, and then look at our own lives and say, the things that look natural, the things that look like purely accidental, are themselves expressions of divine providence.